The night I found out my boyfriend had been laughing at me in a language he thought I didn't understand, I was standing 3 feet away holding a tray of lemonade, smiling like an idiot, while he called me La Tante que cree que lo sabe todo, to the woman he'd been sleeping with behind my back, the fool who thinks she knows everything, and neither of them noticed that Spanish was the first language I ever spoke, the language my grandmother sang to me in before I knew a single word of English. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet kind of hope that rebuilds a broken life piece by piece, I want to invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one matter to our community, and every person who joins our family here helps these stories reach someone who needs them. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Clara Whitfield, and until that afternoon in early June, I believed I was living the kind of life people write greeting cards about. I was 31 years old, an interior designer with a small but growing client list in Charleston, South Carolina, the kind of woman who color-coded her calendar and always remembered to water the ferns on her porch. I had been raised between two worlds. My father was as American as sweet tea and Sunday football, a contractor who built houses with his bare hands, and my mother was born in Bogota, Colombia, a woman who filled our home with the smell of arepas and the sound of boleros on Sunday mornings. Spanish was not a class I took in high school. It was the language of my mother's lullabies, the language I cried in when I skinned my knee at 6 years old, the language that lived somewhere deep and unshakable beneath every English sentence I ever spoke. My mother passed away when I was 24, and after that, Spanish became something sacred to me, something I rarely used out loud because it hurt too much to hear it without her voice answering back. I kept it folded away like an old photograph, tucked into a drawer of my heart that most people never got to see. I had been dating Grant Sullivan for 2 years by the time this story truly begins. Grant was charming in the effortless way that made strangers trust him within minutes. He had that broad, easy smile, that firm handshake, that way of remembering small details about your life and repeating them back to you until you felt like the most important person in the room. He worked in commercial real estate, closing deals with the same charisma he used to close hearts, and when he proposed to me on a pier overlooking the harbor 8 months into our relationship, I said yes before he even finished the question. My friends called us the golden couple. My father, who rarely gave his approval easily, shook Grant's hand and told him to take care of his little girl, and Grant promised he would. I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. The cracks, when I look back now, had been there for months, but I had trained myself not to see them, the way you train yourself not to feel a splinter until it festers. Grant had become distant in small, deniable ways, a phone he angled away from me at dinner, late nights at the office that stretched later than they used to, a new cologne I didn't recognize and never asked about because some part of me was afraid of the answer. I told myself it was stress. I told myself relationships have seasons, and we were simply in a quieter one. I told myself a lot of things that summer, the way people do when the truth is too heavy to carry all at once. The day everything changed started like any ordinary Saturday. Grant had invited a few coworkers over for what he called a casual afternoon get-together at his house, a low brick home with a wraparound porch that backed up to a small private dock. I offered to help him prepare, the way I always did, because even with the distance creeping in, some old habit of love still made me want to take care of him, still made me want to make his life easier. I spent the morning slicing fruit, setting out cloth napkins, arranging chairs on the porch so people could sit comfortably in the shade. I made a pitcher of lemonade the way my mother used to, with fresh mint and a little too much sugar, because it reminded me of her, and because some tiny, hopeful part of me thought that maybe today would remind Grant of why he fell in love with me in the first place. Among the guests that afternoon was a woman named Isabella Reyes, whom Grant introduced as a colleague from a partner firm, someone he'd been working closely with on a new development project downtown. She was polished and confident, with dark hair pulled into a low bun and a laugh that carried easily across a room. I remember shaking her hand and thinking nothing of it, the way you think nothing of dozens of names and faces that pass through your life at gatherings like these. I had no idea, standing there with a genuine smile on my face, that I was shaking the hand of the woman my fiancé had been quietly falling into bed with for the better part of 4 months. The afternoon moved the way afternoons like that always do, easy conversation, the clink of glasses, the low hum of laughter drifting over the water. I moved between guests refilling drinks, playing the role of the gracious hostess I had always been proud to play. At some point, I noticed Grant and Isabella had drifted toward the far end of the porch, near the railing, standing a little closer together than professional colleagues typically stand, their heads tilted toward each other in that particular way that people who share secrets tilt their heads. I told myself it was nothing. I picked up the pitcher of lemonade and walked toward them to offer a refill, the same hospitable gesture I had extended to every other guest that day. As I approached, I heard Grant speaking, low and quick, and at first I assumed he was speaking English simply because that was the only language I had ever heard him use. It took a beat for my mind to catch up to what my ears were hearing. He was speaking Spanish, halting and imperfect, clearly something he had picked up recently, maybe even from Isabella herself, the words clumsy in his mouth but unmistakable in their meaning. He said that I was easy to fool, that I believed everything he told me, that I was, in his words, la tonta que cree que lo sabe todo, the fool who thinks she knows everything. Isabella laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and added something about how sweet it was that I still made lemonade like I was trying to win him back every weekend, how pathetic it was, how she almost felt sorry for me, almost. I want you to understand what that moment did to me, because I don't think words fully capture it even now. It wasn't just the betrayal of the affair, though that alone would have been enough to shatter me. It was the specific cruelty of being mocked in the one language that held my mother's voice, my childhood, every tender and sacred piece of who I was before I ever became someone's fiancé. It was standing there, invisible in plain sight, watching the two people closest to deceiving me completely underestimate the one thing that made me who I was. Grant had spent 2 years learning what songs made me cry, what stories about my mother made my voice catch, and somehow, in all that closeness, he had never once thought to ask what language I dreamed in. He assumed, the way people often assume about anyone with an accent-free American voice, that Spanish was something I had simply never touched. He was wrong, and in that wrongness, he handed me the sharpest, clearest truth of our entire relationship. I did not drop the pitcher. I did not scream. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think there's a version of this story people expect, the version where the wronged woman shatters glass and makes a scene, and that is not what happened. What happened instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more devastating. I felt my whole body go very still, the way the ocean goes still right before a wave pulls back to gather its strength. I finished pouring lemonade into both of their glasses, my hand steadier than I had any right to expect, and I said, in the clearest, calmest Spanish I had spoken aloud in years, that I hoped they both enjoyed the lemonade, since apparently I made it every weekend trying to win back a man who had already left. Grant's face went the color of old paper. Isabella's laugh caught somewhere in her throat and turned into a cough. Neither of them said a single word as I turned, set the pitcher down on the railing with a soft, deliberate click, and walked back into the house that I had spent 2 years helping Grant furnish, past the framed photos of us at the beach, past the engagement ring box still sitting in the drawer of the hallway table where he kept spare batteries and old receipts, and out the front door into the bright, unbothered sunlight of that Saturday afternoon. I drove for almost an hour with no destination in mind, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my mind replaying his words over and over, la tonta, la tonta, la tonta, until the words lost meaning and became just sound, just noise, just the sound of 2 years of my life collapsing in real time. I eventually found myself parked outside my father's house, a modest ranch home on the outskirts of town where I grew up, where the same oak tree still shaded the same gravel driveway it had shaded when I was a child learning to ride a bicycle. My father, Walter Whitfield, opened the door before I even knocked, some instinct in him sensing that his daughter needed him before I said a word. I stood on his porch and told him everything, the affair, the mockery, the Spanish, all of it spilling out in a voice that didn't sound like my own. My father, a man of few words and firm hands, pulled me into a hug that smelled like sawdust and Old Spice, the same hug he'd given me when I skinned my knees decades earlier, and he told me something I have carried with me every day since. He said that the cruelest people in this world are rarely cruel because they're powerful. They're cruel because they've never had to face someone who could see through them, and today, for the first time, Grant Sullivan had. I stayed at my father's house that night, sleeping in my childhood bedroom under a ceiling still dotted with the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck there when I was 9. I did not sleep much. I lay awake staring at those faded plastic stars, thinking about my mother, wishing I could hear her voice one more time, wishing she could tell me it was going to be okay in the language she'd given me, the language that had, in the strangest way, just saved me from staying blind to a truth I might have otherwise never uncovered. Grant called 17 times that night. I watched each call light up my phone and let it ring itself out into silence. Around midnight, he sent a long text message, full of the kind of desperate apologies people write when they've been caught rather than when they've truly understood what they did wrong. He said it meant nothing, that it was a mistake, that Isabella meant nothing to him, that he loved me and only me, and please could we talk. I read the message twice and then set the phone face down on my nightstand, because I understood something in that moment that took me years to fully learn, that an apology which only exists because you got caught is not an apology at all. It's damage control. And I refused, for the first time in a long time, to make myself small enough to accept it. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life, but they were also, strangely, some of the most clarifying. I moved out of the apartment we shared within 2 weeks, boxing up 2 years of shared belongings with the quiet, mechanical efficiency of someone protecting herself from feeling too much at once. My best friend, a fiercely loyal woman named Priya Malhotra who ran a bakery 2 blocks from my design studio, showed up the moment I called her, bringing boxes, bubble wrap, and an entire tray of cinnamon rolls she insisted were, in her words, grief food, and don't argue with me about it. Priya had never fully trusted Grant, something she confessed to me over that tray of cinnamon rolls, sitting on the floor of my half-packed living room. She said there had always been something about the way he spoke about me to other people, like I was an accessory to his success rather than a partner in his life, a detail she'd noticed but never voiced because she didn't want to plant doubt where there might not be cause. I wasn't angry with her for staying quiet. I understood. Sometimes the people who love us hold their tongues because they're hoping, just as hard as we are, that they're wrong. I moved into a small rental cottage near the water, a modest place with creaky floors and a porch just large enough for one chair, which felt, at the time, like an accurate metaphor for the size of the life I thought I had left. My father helped me repaint the walls a soft, warm yellow, the same color my mother had once painted our kitchen back when I was a little girl, and though neither of us said it out loud, I think we both understood why I chose that color. Some part of me was trying to rebuild myself from the ground up using the pieces of my mother that Grant's cruelty had accidentally, painfully, reminded me still lived inside me. Word of the breakup spread quickly through our shared social circles, as these things always do, and I heard through mutual friends that Grant had tried to spin the story, telling people the split was mutual, that we had simply grown apart. I let him have that story if it made him feel better, because I no longer needed anyone else's version of events to validate my own truth. I knew what happened. I had heard it with my own ears, in my own mother's language, and no amount of rewriting could erase that. What surprised me more was learning, weeks later, that Isabella Reyes had also cut ties with Grant almost immediately after that Saturday afternoon, unwilling, apparently, to be associated with a man who had been so carelessly, publicly exposed. There was no triumph in that discovery for me. If anything, it deepened my understanding of what Grant truly was, a man who cared more about being caught than about the people he hurt on his way to being who he wanted to appear to be. The weeks turned into a season, and slowly, quietly, I began to notice small shifts within myself that felt less like healing and more like remembering. I started speaking Spanish again, not in guarded, private moments, but out loud, unafraid. I called my Aunt Rosario in Bogotá, my mother's younger sister, whom I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years because grief had made me avoid anything that reminded me too sharply of my mother. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours. My aunt cried when she heard my voice slip naturally back into the rhythms of Spanish, and she told me that my mother used to say I had her tongue and my father's stubbornness, a combination she always said would either save me or nearly ruin me, depending on the day. I laughed for the first time in weeks during that call, a real laugh, unguarded and full, and I understood that somewhere in the wreckage of my relationship with Grant, I had accidentally found my way back to a part of myself I had let grow quiet out of grief and habit. It was around this time that I met Marcus Delgado, though I want to be honest with you and say this story is not primarily a love story, not in the way people often expect these stories to unfold. Marcus was a woodworker who rented studio space in the same converted warehouse where I met clients for design consultations, a quiet, steady man with sawdust perpetually clinging to his forearms and a habit of humming old boleros while he worked, songs I recognized instantly from my childhood, the same songs my mother used to hum while she cooked. We became friends slowly, over shared coffee breaks and passing conversations in the hallway, long before anything resembling romance entered the picture. Marcus had lost his wife to illness 3 years earlier, and there was a gentleness in him, an earned patience, that came from having survived his own kind of devastating loss. He never asked me to explain what happened with Grant. He simply listened, the few times I offered pieces of the story, without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush me toward some tidy resolution. I came to appreciate, more than almost anything else that year, the quiet dignity of being allowed to grieve at my own pace. But before I let this story drift too far into what came next, I have to tell you about the day Grant showed up at my design studio, nearly 4 months after that Saturday afternoon on his porch. I was meeting with a client, finalizing fabric samples for a living room redesign, when I looked up and saw him standing awkwardly near the front window, holding a small bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers he'd given me the night he proposed. My stomach dropped, not with longing, but with a kind of exhausted wariness, the feeling of seeing a storm you thought had already passed circling back on the horizon. I finished my meeting, walked my client to the door, and then turned to face him, arms crossed, saying nothing, waiting for him to speak first. Grant told me he had spent the last 4 months in therapy, something I hadn't expected to hear from a man who once told me therapy was for people who couldn't handle their own problems. He said the affair with Isabella had ended the same week I found out, not because he chose to end it, he admitted with a rare flash of honesty, but because she had ended it with him, disgusted by how easily he'd been caught and how little accountability he initially showed. He said it had taken him weeks of sitting with that humiliation before he was forced to confront the deeper truth of who he had become in our relationship, a man who had grown so comfortable being adored that he stopped working to deserve it. He apologized for the affair, which I expected, but what surprised me was that he apologized specifically, deliberately, for the Spanish, telling me he understood now that it wasn't just infidelity that broke us, it was the specific cruelty of dismissing a part of me he never bothered to fully know. He said he had actually continued taking Spanish lessons after we broke up, not to win me back, he insisted, but because he wanted to understand, really understand, what he had mocked so carelessly that day. He told me he now knew what La Tanta meant, and that every time he practiced that lesson, he felt sick with himself, understanding fully, for the first time, the weight of what he'd said and who he'd said it about. I stood there listening to him, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not the softening of old love returning, but a strange, clean sense of closure, the kind that comes not from reconciliation but from finally hearing someone take full ownership of the wound they caused. I told Grant that I appreciated his honesty, and I meant it, but that appreciation and forgiveness were not the same thing as a future. I told him that I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine, because I had learned over those 4 months that carrying hatred for him was its own kind of cage, and I no longer wanted to live in any cage built by someone else's choices. But I also told him, gently and firmly, that forgiveness did not mean we would ever again be what we once were, that some doors, once they reveal what's truly on the other side, are better left closed, even when closing them still hurts. Grant nodded, his eyes wet, and he thanked me for hearing him out. He left the lilies on the counter of my studio, and I gave them to my receptionist, who loved white flowers more than I ever had, and I never saw Grant Sullivan again after that day, though I heard, through the quiet channels these things travel, that he continued therapy for years afterward and eventually became, by all accounts, a more humble and self-aware man. I like to think that some good came from all of it, even for him, even though it came at my expense. If this part of the story is resonating with you, if you've ever had to find forgiveness not for someone else's sake but for your own peace, I'd love for you to pause here and leave a comment about a time forgiveness helped set you free, even when it didn't bring reconciliation. Your stories help build the kind of community we're trying to grow here together, and I read every single one. The months following that conversation with Grant became, in many ways, the most transformative of my adult life. I threw myself into my design work with a renewed sense of purpose, taking on projects that challenged me creatively in ways I had quietly avoided during the years I spent making myself smaller to fit into Grant's expectations of who I should be. I redesigned my father's kitchen as a surprise for his 60th birthday, incorporating small details that honored my mother, a hand-painted tile from a market in Bogota that my Aunt Rosario mailed me, a warm color palette pulled directly from old photographs of the kitchen my mother once kept. My father cried when he saw it, a rare sight for a man who prided himself on stoicism, and he told me that walking into that kitchen felt like coming home to a version of our family he thought he'd lost when my mother passed. That project became something of a turning point for my design career as well, featured in a regional magazine that led to a wave of new clients who specifically sought out designs that told personal, cultural stories rather than generic, trend-driven aesthetics. I built an entire section of my growing business around that idea, helping families weave their heritage into the physical spaces they lived in every day, and I often think that none of it would have happened if that Saturday afternoon hadn't cracked me open in the first place. My friendship with Marcus deepened slowly over that same period, built on shared meals, long walks along the harbor, and an ease of conversation that never once made me feel like I had to perform or prove myself. He taught me small pieces of woodworking in his studio on slow afternoons, patiently correcting my grip on his tools, never once making me feel foolish for not knowing something, a small kindness that meant more to me than he probably ever realized given everything I'd been through. I taught him small pieces of Spanish in return, watching him stumble endearingly over pronunciation, laughing with him rather than at him, and somewhere in the middle of all that laughter, I realized I was falling for a man who made me feel like every part of myself, including the parts one had once hidden away out of grief, was worth knowing fully. When Marcus finally asked me, almost a year after we met, if I would consider being more than friends, he did it in Spanish, halting and imperfect but entirely sincere, and I remember crying not out of sadness but out of the overwhelming relief of being seen, fully and completely, by someone who had taken the time to learn the language closest to my heart, not to mock it, but to honor it. I want to pause here and tell you about a moment that happened almost exactly 1 year after that Saturday afternoon on Grant's porch, because I think it captures the heart of everything this story is really about. My Aunt Rosario flew in from Bogota for the first time since my mother's funeral, staying with me in my little yellow cottage by the water. On her second night in town, she cooked arepas in my small kitchen, filling the cottage with the exact same smell that used to fill our home when I was a child, and she taught me, patiently and without judgment for all the years I'd let the recipe slip away from memory, how to make them properly again. We sat on my small porch that evening, the one chair replaced now with two, a detail I'd fixed months earlier without fully realizing why, and we talked for hours in Spanish, easy and unguarded, about my mother, about grief, about the strange, winding path that had led me from heartbreak back to myself. My aunt told me something that night that I think about often. She said that language is not just a way of speaking, it's a way of belonging, and that the moment Grant tried to use my own language as a weapon against me was the exact moment the universe handed me back the key to a home inside myself that I had let grow quiet for too long. She said my mother would be proud, not that I had suffered, but that I had turned that suffering into a return to myself rather than a retreat from the world. I think about that a lot, the difference between retreating and returning. It would have been easy, in the aftermath of Grant's betrayal, to retreat, to grow smaller, warier, more guarded, to decide that love and trust were too dangerous to risk again. Instead, somehow, through a process I still don't fully understand even now, I returned. I returned to my mother's language, to my father's steady presence, to my own creative instincts that I had quietly muted for 2 years to keep Grant comfortable, to a version of myself that was fuller and more whole than the version that existed before that Saturday afternoon ever happened. I don't say any of this to suggest that betrayal is somehow worth it, or that everyone who experiences what I experienced will find their way to the same kind of growth. I know that's not always true, and I know healing doesn't follow a straight or guaranteed path. But I do believe, with everything in me, that pain does not have to be the end of a story. Sometimes it's simply the place where an old story ends so a truer one can begin. Marcus and I have now been together for a little over a year, and though I'm not going to pretend this story ends with some dramatic proposal on a pier, because frankly I've had quite enough of pier proposals for one lifetime, I will tell you that our relationship has been built on the exact opposite foundation of what I had with Grant. There are no hidden phones angled away from view, no cologne I don't recognize, no language used as a weapon behind my back. Marcus learned Spanish not to impress me, but because he wanted full, honest access to every corner of who I am, the same way I've learned to appreciate the quiet, steady patience he brings into every part of his life. We spend Sunday afternoons at my father's house now, all 4 of us, my father, Marcus, my Aunt Rosario when she visits, and me, eating arepas and speaking a mixture of English and Spanish that flows so naturally between us that I sometimes forget which language I'm even speaking in, and I think that's exactly how it should feel. Not performed. Not translated. Just home. I've thought often about what I would say to Grant if I ever saw him again, though our paths haven't crossed in nearly 2 years now. I don't think I'd say anything cruel, and I don't think I'd need to. I think I'd simply tell him thank you, strange as that sounds, because as much as what he did hurt me more deeply than almost anything else in my life, it also handed me an unexpected gift, the gift of being underestimated by someone who thought he knew me completely, and discovering, in that underestimation, exactly how much more of myself there was left to reclaim. I've come to believe that sometimes the cruelest moments in our lives are also, paradoxically, the moments that reveal our deepest strength to us, not because the cruelty was necessary or deserved, but because pain has a way of stripping away everything false until only the truest parts of us remain standing. I did not become stronger because Grant broke my heart. I became stronger because I chose, every single difficult day afterward, to return to myself rather than disappear into the wreckage he left behind. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: the parts of yourself you folded away, the language, the memory, the tradition, the quiet inheritance from someone you love and lost, these things are not weaknesses waiting to be exploited. They are roots. And roots, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how long they've gone quiet, have a way of holding you steady exactly when you need them most, even in moments when the people closest to you have forgotten, or never bothered to learn, how deep those roots truly run. Before we close this story together, I want to ask you something. The way I've come to believe every meaningful story should end with a question rather than just an answer. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when something painful accidentally revealed a strength or a piece of yourself you didn't know you still carried? I would love for you to share that in the comments below, because I believe stories like these grow stronger and reach further when we tell them honestly, together, as a community built on kindness and second chances rather than bitterness and silence. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your own experience with forgiveness or resilience, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder of their own strength today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Every single share, every comment, every subscription helps these stories find the people who need them most, and I'm deeply grateful to every one of you who chooses to be part of our growing family here. As for me, I still make lemonade with too much sugar and fresh mint, the way my mother taught me, though now I make it for a man who has never once used my own language against me, in a kitchen painted the same warm yellow my mother once chose for her own home, surrounded by a family, both given and chosen, who see every part of me clearly and love me for exactly who I am, roots and all. And when I think back now to that Saturday afternoon on Grant's porch, to the sound of my own language being twisted into a weapon by someone who thought I would never understand, I don't feel the sharp sting of humiliation anymore. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange and hard one, for the moment that broke me open just enough to let me finally, fully, come home to myself.